The cassette clicks mid-sentence as one hand yanks the recorder's plug from the wall. The voice dies, leaving only the hum of the fan. The other fingers clutch the note on the table, ink blurred by a spill, the words unreadable, yet the tremor in their knuckles won't relax. Glass erupts under the mug they both reached for, shards scattering like accusations. Something is wrong. The fan keeps turning, blades brushing the same dull spot of painted ceiling they always do in the late afternoon. It's the same insistence that's called the room home for years. They stand in the same narrow kitchen alcove, where the counter is a thin rectangle of marble, the chipped edge a familiar landmark on the right line of sight. One hand moves through the shards in practiced, slow sweeps. The motion someone would make every Tuesday when the mug from the blue shelf slipped too close to the edge, around the precise bend of habit. The other hand pauses at the wall outlet, thumb resting against the still cool plastic of the recorder's casing, then lets the cord return to the counter without dragging it further. The spool of wire settles back into the same little pile, as if it was only ever meant to live there. Across the table, the spilled ink on the torn note glistens under the afternoon light that filters through the blinds, each beam cutting neat lines across the table's wobbly surface. The quiet, punctuated only by the fan and the faint ticking of a clock over the pantry door, is thick but steady, like the room waiting for the next routine step, not for some sudden shift. They exchange no words, just shared movements. A cup lifted, rinsed, placed onto the drying rack beside the sink. A breath taken in and exhaled. The slow drag of a chair back into its proper angle. The air smells faintly of coffee left cooling in the pot and the lemon soap that never changes, anchoring everything to the unremarkable cadence they always navigate. The garage smells of motor oil and damp plywood. Mara drops the toolbox lid with a clank and presses the flashlight beam into the corner where the old scaffolding clamps rusted. Jonah waits with his arms folded, shoulders tight, eyes never leaving her hands. She lifts a bent bolt, the threads half sheared. "You remember the council night," she says, voice steady. "When the west span gave way? I was the one who eased that bolt until it hugged nothing." The air shivers. Jonah's jaw muscles jump. No one ever said a word. Mara keeps going. "We all took the fall, but we never said why the bridge slipped through our hands. The silence was part of the plan. That was my silence. Yours too, maybe. But mine was the spark." Jonah grips the workbench edge, knuckles dragging dim grooves. His fingers brush the chipped paint of the model bridge he keeps on the shelf, the one we all warped with our hands last summer. "You could have told me when the inspectors started asking about the welds." He shoots back, the words sharp enough to lift dust off the bench. He steps toward Mara, the flashlight sliding across her face. "You let the blame settle on the team, on me, while you kept quiet like we always do. That silence kept burning us from the inside." Mara takes a slow drag on the rag, presses it against the bolt, and then sets it on the table like a confession. "I didn't know how to undo it without everyone pointing fingers at me," she says, but her fingers drum the wood, fast. "I thought if we all just acted normal, the blame would drift away. It didn't." Jonah reaches for the bolt, lifts it, and lets it fall. It clangs onto the metal tray with finality. "Then I kept quiet too," he says, "because saying anything would mean admitting I trusted you with everything." The air snaps. Tension sharpens into motion. Mara snatches the phone from the shelf, taps the record button, and slides it toward Jonah. "We've been silent about the bolts," she says, voice lower now, controlled. "But the bolt didn't break cracking the blame. It only deepened that rot between us. If we keep pretending it didn't happen, we'll keep building bridges that fall apart." Jonah grabs the phone, presses stop, then starts a new voice memo. The screen blinks red, recording the words, "The act, a small payment." "You did it. I'm not hiding anymore." He sets the phone down beside the bolt, then takes a slow breath and pulls the scaffolding plan toward them. "I'll show the council the bolt you brought tonight," he says. "You're the only one who knows what that night really was. The silence won't stay buried anymore, even if it eats us both." Mara's hand hesitates over the diagonal drawing of the span. She nods once, tight-lipped, eyes on the lines she once trusted. The resentment lingers, but the air has shifted. The silence has a crack, and now the story leaks through. Jonah keeps the recorder near his palm as Mara wipes grease from the table with the same rag she used on the scaffolding bolts. The room smells of iron and damp canvas. Mara says nothing. The silence is sharp enough that Jonah can hear the tiny clink when someone knocks on the workshop door. Tavi opens it with a hand still dripping from rinsing herbs. Water splashes onto the wooden floorboards. He puts the basket down, presses his fingers against the frame, and finally walks inside without waiting for an invitation. "I thought you two were keeping the silence to yourselves," he says, voice low, eyes flicking to the recorder. "Can I sit?" Jonah nods, letting Mara stay standing. Tavi lowers himself onto the bench and drags his hands over his knees. "Council night," he begins, and the words come out sharp. "I could have called you both out before the speeches. I could have said, 'No, hold the bolt, check the rig.' But I stood at the edge, nodded when they handed me a cup, pretended not to hear the squeal from the scaffolding, pretended not to see Mara slip out." Mara's breath catches. She drums her nail on the table, a quick, nervous rhythm. Jonah leans forward. The recorder picks up every scrape. Tavi slams his palm against the wood, snapping the bench. "I kept the story in the dark because everyone else did. I told myself it wasn't my place, that the battle between you two wasn't mine to break. But I was there. I watched the bolt loosen. I watched Mara leave. I let it happen." Mara swallows, the air trembling around her open lips. She says nothing. The confession lands with a thud, an emotional peak that presses against the walls. "I knew the story was never told aloud," Tavi says, and his hands rise, trembling. "But keeping quiet made it worse. I was afraid. Afraid of splitting us, afraid of being accused of meddling. I can't take back the night, but I can let it be heard now. No more silence." Mara bows her head, fingers curling into a fist that tightens around the rag until the fabric creaks. Jonah reaches under the table, takes Tavi's wrist, and presses the recorder closer. "Say it again," he murmurs, soft but firm. "I need you to say exactly what happened, without the excuses." Tavi exhales, head lifting. "I accepted the failure in my silence," he says, eyes fixed on Mara. "I carry that failure with me every time the story's told. That's what's true. I let the betrayal happen by walking away from it." Mara doesn't speak. Instead, she steps forward, the rag falling from her fingers as if gravity wants it gone. She reaches for Tavi's hand, wraps her palm around his. Tight, urgent. The touch is small, but it is tangible release. Jonah hits stop on the recorder, careful, letting the moment settle. "Now it's out," Mara says in a voice that is a rasp from the weight she has carried. "We have the words. We breathe them into the same air for the first time." Tavi nods, and the three of them sit in the wooden stillness with the recorder between them. The confession recorded and the guilt shared, however uneasily. The story is no longer locked inside any one person, and with each heartbeat, the room shifts. Tiny, hard-earned reward for facing the truth. Tavi flicked on the lamp over the narrow table, the light slicing through the dusk haze that had crept into the meeting room. Jonah slid the recorder across the grain of the wood, fingers brushing the worn edges as if to steady it. "Play it now," Tavi said. And Kael, flanked by Lira, leaned in until the hiss of the machine filled the space between them. Mara's voice, ragged and steady in turn, filled the small room. Jonah kept his thumb on the pause button, pressing the moment that Mara admitted loosening the bolt. The confession was no longer something they carried alone. Kael's jaw worked. He didn't speak until the recording finished. Then the silence snapped when he slammed his palm flat against the table. "You wanted to keep her name sacred," he spat, eyes flicking between the two of them. "I watched the council give her a badge, and all I felt was the cold ache of being left behind again and again." He jabbed his finger at the recorder. "I saw momentum swirl out of reach, and every time she turned to the counselors, I shrank. That jealousy ripped up what I knew was right." He pressed his forehead to his knuckles, breath coming out sharp. "The sabotage isn't just a bolt. It's proof that someone was trying to be seen, that someone was clawing for a place when no one else looked their way." His voice broke as he pulled upright, eyes burning. "You think silence could save us? Silence is the lash I wrap around myself every night for not yelling, not warning, not standing in front of that scaffold. It's punishment already laid down before any council hearing." He stared at Tavi. "Let that go. Tell them everything now." Lira stepped forward, hands clasped so tight her knuckles blanched. "Mara hasn't been the only one to feel abandoned," she whispered, breath warming the open air between them. "I remember her laughter echoing through the hall when the council visited, and I remember the heights she reached while I hovered in the wings, jealous and quiet. When I kept my mouth shut, imagining silence would hold the fractures together. I only kept dressing the wound in salt. Every night I replay the choices I didn't make. Something about the hush feels like I'm stabbing myself again." She looked at Kael, eyes glossy but resolute. "If this story stays buried, I'm the one who keeps punishing us. So I'm going to stand in the hall tonight and demand they hear the recording." She glanced at Jonah. "You're right here with us, so make sure they can't say we never said it aloud." Jonah slid the recorder toward Lira. Her fingers trembled as she took it, a minute exchange that felt like a torch passing. Tavi nodded at her. A hard line formed around his mouth, but his hands were steady on the table. Kael exhaled, a long, heavy release. The tension in his shoulders eased enough to let him step back, not away from the truth, but toward it. Together, they packed the recorder into its case, planning to bring it straight to the council briefing that same night. No more silence, no more self-inflicted punishment. Just the record of what had happened and the faces who could attest to why it happened. The room felt tighter, every breath sharper, but also clearer. Like the path forward was now drawn in ink that couldn't be washed away by another night of quiet. The briefing room smelled of cold coffee and sharp paper. Kael stood with his back to the chalkboard, fists braced on the ledge, while Lira slid into the nearest chair like she had been trying to outrun the moment. She didn't meet his eyes. "You heard it," Kael said, voice low enough to keep the door from rattling but hot enough to make his words land in her chest. "You heard Mara. You had the recording. You watched the council drown in that silence. Why didn't you say anything before it broke everything?" Lyra's fingers curled around the edge of the table, knuckles paling. "Because I thought silence was safer," she whispered, the words tumbling out too fast. "Because I thought calling it out would ruin the only thread we had left. I thought if I kept quiet, no one else would feel abandoned like I do. To lose you all again, Kael slammed his palm down, the vibration rattling the pen cup. Abandonment doesn't stop being abandonment if you trust it to rot in your jaw, he said. I've been watching you cut yourself on it every day. We need the truth out there, Lira. Not just for Mara, not just for Tavi, but for us. For the council. For the trust you choked on. Her eyes flashed, tear-bright beneath her lashes. I punished myself, she said, voice chewy with effort. I kept quiet because I believed silence would mend the fracture my jealousy made. I thought if I didn't speak, the council might still hold together without my mess. But every night, I woke up thinking I had deserved what happened to us. Kael leaned forward. The recording device Jonah had handed him now rested between them, an object heavy with accusation and protection. We kept that confession because none of us could stand doing nothing, he said. He didn't ask for silence this time. He took it away with both hands. We're going into that briefing with Mara's words, with Tavi's admission, with me standing next to you instead of across the room. You owe them. She exploded in a breath, letting out a sharp laugh that rattled the room. I owe them a voice, yes. The same voice that's been breaking itself on your doorstep. She rose, stepping over the bundle of cables, facing Kael full on. I will take that confession out there. I will sit beside you. He straightened, and for the first time in days, they were eye level. Then we both go in, Kael said. We don't let them parse it without us. No more silence. No more bearing it alone. Lira nodded, and the motion steadied the tension between them, like a crack widening only so it could be filled. We go in together, she repeated. He touched the recorder, the small plastic case suddenly opaqued. Tell them everything, Kael murmured. Let the council hear the crack, Lira. Let them start mending it with us watching. Kael stood with his back against the stone balustrade outside the council chamber, the recorded confession clutched in one hand like a hot coal. Lira came around the corner, breath catching in the low light, and the moment she saw the tape, she stopped 2 strides short. The hallway buzzed with the distant murmur of arriving delegates. But between them, it was only the scrape of Kael's boot against the floor and the faint ticking of the wall clock. You taped it then? She asked, and he nodded once without looking at her. He lifted the recorder, thumb hovering over the play button. I needed proof so no one could bury it again. But it isn't just Mara's voice I can't ignore anymore. He exhaled, and the sound cracked. I watched you keep your mouth shut because you didn't want to fracture us in front of everyone. I watched myself keep quiet because I didn't want to look weak, that I couldn't handle Kael's share of the council's expectations. Every time I let that go, the resentment hardened. I let it harden into sabotage. He slammed the recorder down on the table, and both of them flinched at the sudden sharp echo in the corridor. Lira stepped forward, fingers pressing into the grain of the railing. I kept silent because I thought staying quiet meant protecting you, protecting the council, she said, voice low enough that the muffled footsteps couldn't hear. I told myself that if I held my tongue, we wouldn't explode. But holding my tongue let Mara think isolation meant forgiveness, and I watched you carry that anger like a weapon. I wanted to preserve the peace for myself, to avoid another fight, and I muted our chance to heal. She met his eyes. That's self-preservation. It let resentment turn into the sabotage that burned the council night to ash. Kael's jaw tightened. He leaned in so close Lira could see the tremor under his skin. It was easier to blame the council for Mara's sabotage than to admit I let jealousy replace trust, he said. I kept the facts from the council because I didn't want to be seen as the brother who couldn't fix this. I prioritized my image over our reconciliation. That's why the sabotage went unchecked. I'm tired of letting my fear calcify into harm. He dragged his hand through his hair and then, abruptly, reached for Lira's wrist, pulling her toward him by the soft cloth of her sleeve. "We can't walk into the briefing with this between us," he added, softer now. "We bring it together. We both confess we chose self-preservation over each other once already. Don't let it happen again." Lira hesitated a heartbeat, then nodded. She slid the recorder to him and took the other copy from the pouch on her belt, holding it out. "I'll say what I held back," she said, hands shaking only slightly. "You say what you hid. We speak after Mara's confession is played. The room will hear that this isn't just Mara's burden." Her grip tightened enough that Kael could feel the pulse jumping at her wrist. Now the council hears it raw. Jonah's hand trembled the last time the recorder clicked shut, and the council chamber held its breath. The air tasted of old stone and fresh wound. Mara stood rigid, shoulders bared to the hush that pressed close. Tavi's fingers curled into a promise around Jonah's wrist, his eyes never leaving the small shine of the recorder's face. Kael stepped beside Lira, not touching yet, but close enough that their shadows pooled together on the worn floor. The voice of Mara, raw from the evening, spilled across the room, and when the last words faded, something unlocked. Silence did not follow. Instead, the lowered hum of people feeling the weight of what had been kept. They did not look away. Instead, they leaned in, not to mend, but to acknowledge that the hurt was there, and theirs to carry. Outside the chamber doors, the city's lights blinked as if aware that this night would not retreat into old quiet. The lesson already woven into the fabric of all who gathered.